We're here today to thank President Trump for everything he's doing and to make South Africa great again.
Advocating for Donald Trump and Elon Musk to have a look into the country and to the political stance what's happening here.
South Africa recently found itself in the global spotlight after a series of events that underscored the complexities of race, land ownership, and international politics. It all began when former U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order cutting U.S. aid to South Africa, while also offering refugee status to white South Africans, particularly the Afrikaner community. The move came in response to the South African government's newly enacted land expropriation law, a policy designed to address historical land disparities stemming from apartheid and colonialism. While many within the Afrikaner community saw Trump's decision as a lifeline, others viewed it as a politically motivated intervention that ignored South Africa's historical context and broader social realities. The reaction to Trump's announcement was immediate. In Pretoria, outside the U.S. Embassy, hundreds of white South Africans gathered in a show of support for the former U.S. president. Many carried banners with slogans such as "Thank God for President Trump" and "Stop the Land Grabs." The crowd, predominantly composed of Afrikaners, voiced their fears about what they saw as an existential threat posed by the land expropriation policy. Many of them had grown up hearing stories of their ancestors who tilled the land, and they saw the policy as an erasure of their heritage. For them, Trump's intervention wasn't just about politics, it was about survival. However, this perspective is not universal among South Africans. The country's ruling party, the African National Congress, ANC, along with many black South Africans, viewed Trump's order as a distortion of reality. They argue that the Expropriation Act is not about targeting white landowners, but rather about addressing the severe land inequalities that have existed for generations. Under apartheid, black South Africans were systematically removed from their lands and forced into overcrowded townships, while vast tracts of fertile farmland were handed to white settlers. Even after apartheid ended in 1994, much of the country's farmland remained in white hands, with black South Africans owning only a small fraction of the land. President Cyril Ramaphosa and his administration have consistently maintained that the land reform policies are necessary to correct these historical injustices. They argue that land reform is not about punishing one race, but about creating a more equitable and just society. Critics of Trump's intervention say that his actions ignore this historical context and are instead aimed at appealing to his conservative base in the U.S., where he has long positioned himself as a defender of white farmers under attack. The issue of land in South Africa is not new. It has deep historical roots that date back to colonial times. The 1913 Natives Land Act was one of the earliest laws that restricted land ownership for black South Africans, limiting them to just 7% of the country's land despite making up the majority of the population. Over the years, more laws were enacted to entrench this racial disparity, culminating in the forced removals of the apartheid era. Entire communities were uprooted and relocated to barren lands, while white-owned farms and businesses thrived on the fertile soil. With the end of apartheid, land reform was one of the key promises made by Nelson Mandela's government. However, progress has been slow. The initial approach was based on the willing buyer, willing seller model, where the government would buy land from white farmers and redistribute it to black citizens. But this method proved ineffective. The government lacked the funds to purchase land at market prices, and many white landowners were unwilling to sell. As a result, nearly 30 years after apartheid, land ownership remains deeply skewed in favor of the white minority. The Expropriation Act of 2024 is the government's latest attempt to speed up land reform. The law allows for the expropriation of unused or underutilized land without compensation, provided it is for public use. The government has assured citizens that productive farms will not be taken arbitrarily, but this has done little to ease the fears of many white landowners. They argue that the policy could lead to economic instability and food shortages, much like what happened in Zimbabwe when the government seized white-owned farms in the early 2000s. Zimbabwe's case is often cited as a cautionary tale. Under Robert Mugabe's leadership, the Zimbabwean government forcibly took land from white farmers and redistributed it to black citizens, many of whom lacked the necessary resources and training to maintain large-scale farming operations. The result was a sharp decline in agricultural production, leading to economic collapse, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment. Critics warn that South Africa could suffer a similar fate if land expropriation is mishandled. However, supporters of the policy argue that South Africa's approach is fundamentally different. Unlike Zimbabwe, where land seizures were often violent and chaotic, South Africa's process is supposed to be governed by law and focused on unused land. Additionally, they argue that land reform is not just about economics, it's about justice. They point out that many black South Africans remain landless and live in poverty because their ancestors were stripped of their land through colonialism and apartheid. Without meaningful land reform, true economic equality will remain out of reach. Beyond the land issue, Trump's executive order also had a broader geopolitical dimension. South Africa's foreign policy has not always aligned with U.S. interests, particularly in recent years. The South African government has been vocal in its support for Palestinian rights and has criticized Israel's military actions in Gaza. This has put it at odds with U.S. foreign policy, especially under Trump, who has been a staunch supporter of Israel. Some analysts believe that Trump's decision to cut aid to South Africa was not just about land reform, but also about pressuring the country to align more closely with U.S. interests. Another key player in this saga is Elon Musk, the South African-born billionaire who has been increasingly critical of the South African government. Musk has publicly condemned the country's affirmative action policies, arguing that they stifle innovation and economic growth. His attempts to introduce his Starlink satellite internet service in South Africa have faced regulatory hurdles due to the government's requirements for local ownership and black economic empowerment. Many believe that Musk's personal frustrations with the South African government have influenced his support for Trump's executive order. For ordinary South Africans, the real question is what comes next. Will the land reform policy achieve its intended goals, or will it lead to economic turmoil? Will the U.S. decision to cut aid have long-term consequences for South Africa's economy? These are pressing concerns that will shape the country's future. In the meantime, the divide between those who support the land reform policy and those who oppose it continues to widen. While many black South Africans see it as a long overdue step toward justice, many white landowners feel abandoned and fearful of what the future holds. The protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria were just one manifestation of these deep-seated tensions. They reflect the broader struggle South Africa faces in balancing economic growth, social justice, and national unity. The world will be watching closely as South Africa moves forward with its land reform efforts. Whatever happens next, it is clear that the debate over land will remain one of the most contentious and defining issues in the country's future.
Is literally placing policy and positioning South Africa as a divided nation. And in that in itself, it corrupts in different levels. It brings the concept of peace and reconciliation.
With regards to the government corruption that's happening, I think most of the country, I love my country and I love the diversity that we have. You can see I've got South African socks on. I support my country and my country supports me.
Fortunately, the truth of the 30 years is that we have a divided country that focus on a point to a government.
We want South Africa back like it used to be. For everybody, it's got the same rights. Not just the ANC, they must consider us as well.